Helen Child, co-founder of Open Banking Excellence, and Nicholas Webb from the FCA join us for a fireside chat on open finance and improved financial health.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I think you've got the gist. My name's Helen Child. And before I introduce my guest, Nicholas, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Ralph, Mark, and the team for putting on UK Fintech Week. I have a little experience with being the co-founder of Open Banking Excellence, OBE as we affectionately call it, how much effort goes in to putting on a show, and hats off to them doing this so quickly as we come out through the pandemic. So well done, Team UK Fintech Week. So I am delighted to have a fireside chat with the regulator. What a privilege. Nicholas, please say hello and a little bit about what you do for the FCA, please.
Hi, so I'm Nicholas Webb. I currently manage the FCA's payments policy team. No, I need the microphone as well. Cool. Hi, so I'm Nicholas Webb. I currently manage the FCA's payments policy team. We're responsible for all aspects of payment service and payment systems regulation within the Financial Conduct Authority. So that includes open banking and open finance. I've been doing open banking for the past 8 years now, nearly. I think it was the first thing I did when I joined the FCA in 2014. So I've now picked up the mantle for open finance. Share.
We're going to be a great double act, aren't we, here? Okay, maybe if we just reduce the social distancing a little, it might help. Shh. I won't tell if you don't. Okay, so what I wanted to do was, first of all, just tell you a little bit about the amazing community that I've co-founded. Open Banking Excellence, OBE, is a platform, and we have a vision to be the global centre of a community. First and foremost, we're a community that shares knowledge and drives the conversation. So we are that independent arbitrator for an industry conversation. Now, we started off as 38 fintechs in a room, and we are now a global community of over 15,000, which is absolutely phenomenal. We have 54 different countries. And my Brittany mic is working now. We have 54 different countries around the world tuning in. And that goes to show the absolute growth trajectory of the amazing sector that we all have a privilege to work in. And what I actually did before I came on stage was talk to Giovanni. He's on our head of blog and he's our researcher. He's the first person in the world to have a PhD in open banking because we want to have an authoritative conversation. And I thought it would be good to have a look at some of the figures. And they are quite phenomenal. And I think given the backdrop we've had this week, we should be proud and we should fly the flag. I even came down with my flag on the back of the jacket that you might have seen. So let's just have a look at the numbers before we hear from Nicholas. So we all know that OBIE, when it was created, and these numbers came from OBIE, just phenomenal. And, hats off to them as well. 315 regulated providers, and they are made up from 228 third-party providers. Now, I believe that the TTPs are going to play a real place, and they're going to have more importance in the ecosystem going forward, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. 85 account providers and 113 regulated entities, all with at least one live program in the market. That is a phenomenal. And then if you actually have a look at the API transactions, now clearly some of these are going to be test calls, but we started off in 2018 at 66.8 million. Now we're at 6 billion. That is just a phenomenal figure. And if you just look at that context, and I think that goes to show that we are and you've heard a lot about this from Ron and from Imran today, but we are at that early majority stage. We have, Nicholas, would you say grown up? Are we teenagers now?
Yeah, that's how I would describe fintech. It's in its teenage stage. It's pushing the boundaries. It needs to know when the boundaries are, but given the space to grow in the right way.
So it's probably a good way just to reflect a little on what we've heard so far today. I mean, Imran talked about the need for a regulatory nudge, he called it. I'd be interested really from the regulator's perspective, your view on that.
I think that's probably right. I think if we look back to the lessons learned from open banking, It's taken a long time to get to where we are today. There were various stalled initiatives along the way on a voluntary basis, but it wasn't until we had PSD2, it wasn't until we had the CMA order that we were able to start to change the cultures within firms to create the right environment for open banking to thrive.
I would agree. So one of the privileges that I have being the co-founder of OBE is to talk to regulators and policymakers around the world. Our community is made up of those and big techs, fintechs, and service providers. And there's always the debate whether it should be market-led or regulatory-led. And what I will tell you is that everybody looks at the UK. I mean, in the Fingleton report, they talk about the UK creating the blueprint, the template for open banking. And there's a huge amount of lessons learned. And again, that's not beating ourselves up. That is actually, we have done a huge amount of good. And if you just reflect on some of those headline figures, there's a lot of lessons learned. So Nicholas, I'm curious, if from the backdrop of lessons learned, and we have, the regulators and policymakers around the world looking at what we do next, it's a lovely segue to have a look at and just to gently talk through the call for input and how you have used some of those lessons learned and how we can actually hard code those in going forward.
Yeah, so we recently published the feedback statement following our call for input in 2019. I think as the previous panel mentioned, open finance has slowed over the past years, and rightly so, as resources were stretched in other ways. But following the call for input, we received 169 responses from across all sectors, which is fantastic, and gave us a real insight into what's needed to move the open finance conversation forwards. So, as I say, open banking, it got off to a slow start, but it's certainly growing. Is it the best it can be yet? Personally, probably not. I think that the limited range of data that you can get through PSD2 means that many of the use cases which are going to provide real benefits to UK consumers and SMEs aren't yet fully viable or sustainable until we extend out to other products. So a roadmap is going to be a key part of that. Many of the responses, is interesting, had common themes. So there is generally an expectation or a need, or recognition, for the need of a regulatory framework. We talked about compulsion a second ago. I think it depends on what that framework needs to look like. We as the regulator probably aren't best placed to develop detailed technical and operational standards for how APIs and open finance should operate. Similarly, open finance is across multiple sectors, so the standards that work in open banking might not be the right standards for other sectors. And it's important we can listen to the other sectors and hear what works for them. I think one of the key lessons that we learned from open banking is the need to think about use cases, but have the end user and the TPP in the conversation from day one. There is always going to be a natural tension between what the data holders are happy and willing to provide versus what the innovators want to get access to. And it's not to say that either is wrong, but that each can learn from one another so that we get open finance to the right place.
So stakeholder engagement, TTPs and the consumers being involved at day one.
Exactly, and that's something that we're already trying to facilitate at the regulator. So following the publication of our feedback statement, we've already reached out to several leading trade associations to start to develop a minimum data set, to start to think about which products should go first in the roadmap. We're having conversations this week with consumer and TPP groups to understand how best to involve them in that conversation. I think the other challenge we have to recognise is today there are only so many TPPs. Yes, there are 150 or so, but they have day jobs. So how can we best utilise their time to feed into the open finance conversation?
So keeping it with the lessons learned then, what can we design in? You're talking about standardising API performance, and I think that's going back to what Imran was saying. Being a regulatory driven, and we have had a very strong framework thanks to OBIE, that has allowed us to accelerate far faster in Europe, in the UK than in Europe. We are certainly the early adopters, and they have a fair bit of catching up to do. So the whole standardisation thing, I think everybody would agree on that. But how about dispute resolution frameworks and access to dashboards? What are we going to do there?
I think, yeah, those are very good examples. So the Which surveys from 2019 showed that only 25% of people knew about open banking. I suppose I disagree from some of the speakers earlier. Do users of open banking services need to know about open banking? Do people that make payments need to know what faster payments is and how the infrastructure works? Probably not. When you make a payment, you want to ensure that it's safe, it's secure, that it's going to get to where it's meant to go to. It's going to do what it says on the tin. And I think those are key lessons that we can apply to open banking and to open finance.
It's just plumbing.
In some respects, the standards and the operationalisation of it are certainly plumbing. But the benefits of access dashboards, how that builds trust.
Yeah.
The benefits of transparent consent journeys, again, how that builds trust. A strong liability and dispute resolution framework, as you mentioned, so that when things go wrong, customers aren't being pushed from pillar to post as these chains do become increasingly complex. Previously, you went to your bank on the high street. It was relatively simple. It's going to become far more complicated. Now, that complication is going to deliver benefits for the end user, but we have to make sure that those benefits don't get lost in that complexity.
Okay, lost in the complexity. So how can we make that simpler? Well, let's talk about which products and which minimum data sets. We've all agreed there needs to be a framework and some standards. So I'm curious in terms of products and data sets. Where are we going there?
So that's exactly the conversation that we're looking to have today with the industry, with the TPPs and with the end users. Respondents to our call for input raised several different ways, I suppose, that you could prioritise based on complaints, based on friction, based on target markets and customer bases. There are products which are probably relatively easier to implement today than others. An extension of retail current accounts and credit cards naturally looks to savings, for example. Some simple retail lending products potentially are easier to deliver than, for example, pensions, long-term investment products, etc. Again, we look to the technology that's within firms. Retail banks, yeah, their infrastructure may not be as good as some of the fintechs like to think, but it's probably, or was probably a lot better than some of the older investment houses are today. So how can we bring them along with this, and how can we provide the time and the space for them to develop things sooner?
So the products we're looking at, obviously we've got open banking, open pensions, open savings we talked about, and obviously the other side of the ledger, you've got open saving, we all talk about how to, both sides of the ledger, and that will give us a wider one single view of the customer. Yeah. Exactly.
The killer app, I don't think, has yet come to market, but in order to do that, I think we do need to see both sides of the ledger. I think listening to Klarna earlier was interesting, understanding more about customers' lending position, understanding what their short-term financial position is versus their long-term financial position, and therefore how to maximise sweeping use cases is going to be key here. But we also have to recognise that the risks associated with open banking are going to be different to the risks associated with some of these other sectors. Your insurance product, your investment product. Do you want customers to be snacking on those products, to be dipping in and out of them frequently, or are they better off leaving it for a longer period of time? All of these questions are ones that we want to work through with the industry and have that conversation.
That's a good question then. So let's just have a little bit of a walk through what are the risks and the challenges and the difference between open banking and open finance. What would you say are the key differences in risks and challenges?
I think that's probably one of the main risks, is it's the different nature of the products involved. Your transaction accounts are transactional, they're day-to-day. Yes, having a long-term view is interesting, but it's probably the last 90 days or so that's most interesting to firms. Whereas your pension product, your long-term investment products, you can suffer harm if you do transact too frequently on those products. So how can we make sure that customers or consumers realise the full benefits, but are sufficiently transparent they understand the nature of what they're doing and the consequence of it?
Something very key to, or close to rather, our heart at OBE, where we believe in promoting innovation for the growth trajectory of the sector, but for better financial inclusion globally. It's something we do a lot of work on and behind the scenes, which is a lovely segue then to talk about digital exclusion. Something that Ron Cleaver has touched on this morning, but he wrote about in his report. So I'm interested to to talk more around digital exclusion and the FCA, our regulators' viewpoint on that, because you can create the framework that really will include those that, or help to include those that are digitally excluded. You can make a huge amount of difference. What's the FCA's thinking on this one now?
So digital exclusion is a very important topic, and I think there are probably lessons that we all need to reflect on from COVID and to understand how consumers engage with their financial services during the crisis, who lost out, who gained, etc. One of the key points that we'll need to consider is, yes, there will be early adopters, yes, there will be fast followers from a user perspective, but not everybody will engage with these services. So how can we make sure that they aren't left out in the cold and that the benefits that competition will bring are felt evenly across all consumer groups?
And how can we as a community, as an industry, as a sector, support our regulator and collaborate? What would you like to see from everybody, and not just in the room, but everybody in the industry? What would your call out to the industry be?
Have an open mind. Come to the table. We want to hear from you, but come to the table willing to share ideas, willing to accept that what the viewpoint you bring might not be the full picture, and that's why we need to make sure that everyone's at that table, both the TPPs, the end users, and the current data holders.
So it's all about collaboration. So my last question before we move on to lunch would be around, we talked about at the beginning, we started our fireside chat talking about a regulatory nudge, okay? What do you think the impact of regulations is on small and larger businesses? Before we talked about it being, do you think it's a kick for making things happen, for getting the party started on new products?
I think regulation can be a tool that can trigger innovation. Proportionality is, of course, always going to be key here. We want to make sure that, yes, we have a safe environment in which these things can grow, but we also need to ensure there is enough space within the regulatory perimeter for these new ideas to grow and foster.
Mm. Well, Nicholas, we were given 15 minutes and we really could have talked for a lot longer. But I don't want to keep you from your lunch and from something you've all been dying to do during the pandemic, and that's to catch up with old friends and to do a little bit of networking. But before we go, I would like Nicholas to sum up in a few words your viewpoint on where we are in terms of open banking, open finance, and again, what we can all do to help our regulator.
So I think we've made some great progress with open banking. The figures are very impressive, especially when we look to other jurisdictions. But as I say, there is more to do. It's going to be a relatively long journey. I think it's not going to be a big bang approach for open finance, and that's very much the message we got in the call for input. But right now, yes, there's a need for compulsion, but there's things you can do now. You can be having these conversations within your firms. You can be putting it into your strategy. You can be thinking about how can we deliver a commercial benefit from this? How can we use this as a reason to upgrade our infrastructure? Changing culture within firms, I think, was one of the biggest wins that open banking has achieved. There will be a team who are very passionate about open banking, very passionate about open finance, but you've got to start spreading that message to everybody internally so that the barriers that you can face when trying to make change are addressed sooner rather than later. And talk to each other, talk to us. We want to hear from you. We will make ourselves available as best we can to hear your views on all of these points, because we don't have all the answers, and it'd be wrong for me to sit here and say that we did. We'll have to do this together. So
it's all about collaboration, which is a nice way for me to wrap up, actually, because OBE in our strapline, it's all about learn, innovate, and collaborate. And if anybody is interested in finding out a little bit more about OBE, we have a campfire every third Thursday of the month. So in a couple of days' time, it's around open banking around the world. And I would encourage you to tune in. We have thousands tuning in. And the previous month, we had Ron Cleaver talking about his report. So if you want to jump onto our website or jump onto LinkedIn, you can actually see Ron talking with Kelly Devine, the president of MasterCard, and Lord Holmes, Chris Holmes, who I know is a speaker here later on in the week. For some more insight on open banking, because clearly 15 minutes just wasn't enough, Nicholas. We could have talked for a lot longer. And hopefully if we finish on time, they'll invite us back again. So everybody, thank you very, very much for your time. Enjoy your lunch. and most of all, enjoy catching up with everybody you have been dying to see for months and months and months. Have fun, and thank you very much for listening.